The strip of sky I could see from my office window was the color of pencil lead, a flat gray smudged by rain. The coffee machine hissed as if trying to breathe for me, sending up steam that curled like handwriting. The building across the street, a concrete monolith with mirrored windows, wore the city's morning like a soaked jacket. I watched the trickle of people under their umbrellas move in thin, determined lines, while my inbox throbbed with deadlines and the kind of minor disasters that become major if ignored. A storm pressed its face against the glass, and somewhere in the distance I imagined jazz, the low sort that doesn't demand attention until you realize your pulse has begun to follow it. I had been at Halbert and North, an architecture and redevelopment firm with a habit of using beautiful words to describe ruthless decisions, for 11 years. Long enough to measure my life in board packets and the weight of binders. Long enough to have risen to senior director of communications through endurance and the quiet practical miracles of knowing where each sentence would land. My divorce had become final 3 autumns earlier. I had learned to sleep again, to make an omelette for one, to laugh out loud at a sitcom rerun without reaching for a hand that no longer cupped mine. I had learned, mostly, to find the comfort in solitude. Still, some mornings felt like the slow turn of a key in an empty lock, movement without a rival. The morning the new CEO arrived, the storm made everything seem more dramatic, as if the skyline had been lined with mascara. He was introduced in carefully worded emails and a press release I had been allowed to edit but not write, a small humiliation. Interim CEO, though we all knew interim could stretch for years. His name was Richard Hale, and it came with its own weather. Former turnaround specialist, a reputation for reshaping companies without theatrics, the kind of presence that turned conspiratorial whispers into neatly labeled folders. I scanned his background and noted the details that mattered for my work. Ivy League architecture degree he never practiced with. MBA he had practiced too much with. A widow for 5 years if rumors were to be trusted. I cataloged his phrasing in past interviews. I circled a sentence in which he said buildings were just the most honest kind of conversation a city could have with itself. It wasn't an original idea, but he had said it cleanly. He arrived without an entourage, which was its own kind of spectacle. He moved through the corridor with a pace that made everyone simultaneously step back and inch forward. Someone from HR trailed him with an umbrella, still dripping. When he reached my doorway, I noticed that he didn't pause to check if he was interrupting. He simply appeared, the way a decision does in a crisis. He offered his hand. His palm was dry, his grip steady. He glanced at my whiteboard calendar and the stacks of speech drafts arranged by a system that made sense only to me. He didn't smile. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging that I had anticipated his arrival even before I knew him. I said I had blocked time to prepare his remarks for the upcoming investor summit. His voice was lower than I expected when he replied that he preferred to write his own speeches and that he had already drafted something that captured his vision. He asked if I would review it for minor corrections, his tone somewhere between courtesy and warning. He left a printed draft on my desk, a stack of crisp, expensive paper that still carried the faint scent of toner and rain. After he left, I read it once, then again. It wasn't bad. It was competent. It ticked nearly every box. Restructuring, stakeholder commitments, leaner processes, targeted investments. But somewhere amid the bullet points his sentences lost pulse. He had built a bridge of words without traffic. It would hold weight. It would not move anyone. I set it aside and answered 3 urgent emails. I waited until the coffee cooled. Then I picked up my pen. The biggest risk in my job had never been a scandal or even an angry client. The biggest risk was believing that competence was enough. I kept his architecture of ideas metaphor, but traced in the missing lines of why. I remembered the city as it looked at night, when I sometimes walked home instead of calling a car. The way the buildings leaned against the skyline like old friends leaning against a bar. I made his promises precise and the metrics inevitable. I cut his thunderous verbs until I could hear a human voice beneath them, weathered and restrained. I felt strangely like I was trespassing, as if I had entered a house where the furniture had been arranged with intention and simply moved the chair closer to the lamp. He returned at 4. The rain had moderated to a steady whisper. He stood in my doorway without speaking. I handed him the marked-up draft with clean pages attached. I told him calmly that I had taken liberties. He read while standing, an old soldier's habit some executives never shed. His eyes moved the way a surveyor's would over a piece of land. The silence stretched thin enough for me to hear the elevator's distant hum and a chuckle from the outer bullpen. When he turned to the clean draft, his shoulder muscles eased an invisible inch. He asked what I had changed, as if testing whether I might bluff. I told him the truth, only the part that mattered. He looked up, and our gazes met the way two unfamiliar roads meet at a traffic circle. Cautious, calculating the right exit. He said we would rehearse tomorrow morning. He did not thank me. The absence of the word felt almost like respect. Word spread in the office by evening, carried in the low current of whispered hallway rumors. Someone in design told someone in finance that the new CEO had let me rewrite his speech, which translated within an hour to the new CEO couldn't write to save his life and had been rescued by his communications director. I walked through the glass-walled corridor that connected our 2 floors, watched my reflection move between the panes, and decided to pretend I couldn't hear any of it. I returned to my office and made notes about the investor questions he would face. My handwriting, small and stubborn, climbed across the page with the same determined tilt it had in college lecture halls. We rehearsed at 7, the fluorescent lights not yet warmed to their full judgment. I set a glass of water in front of him and remained sitting, letting him find the rhythm alone. He read well, better than many, the baritone pace of a man used to negotiating without showing his appetite. But he still swallowed certain lines, as if doubting his right to make them. I made small adjustments, changing a "we will" to a "we are," moving a comma so a breath could fall in the right place. These were surgical things, practiced things. But the space between the practical and the personal began to smudge. In the elevator after, we stood at polite distances. I could smell the dry linen of his suit warmed by skin, some subtle cologne that didn't announce itself. He asked, without looking at me, why I had chosen to stay at Halberd and North for so long. I told him I liked the way buildings stored memory even when people didn't, and that there was a kind of integrity in making an entire city a story. He nodded as if I had passed a test he hadn't proctored. Investor Day brought the deep blue morning that follows night rain, the sidewalks slick as freshly printed gloss. The ballroom lights at the hotel were unforgiving. They spotlighted both pores and duplicity. He stood at the podium, and I watched from the wings, the way I had watched so many men speak under these chandeliers, confident, nervous, or worse, bored by their own power. He started strong. When he reached the paragraph about risk and public trust, where I had penciled in a sentence about neighborhoods not being spreadsheets, he paused as if the words were heavier than he had expected. He lifted his gaze and delivered it to the room instead of the page. Heads tipped forward slightly, the investor version of leaning in. It is a moment I live for, the tightrope between language and consequence, the hush of possible change. He made it across as if he knew the rope had always been there. Afterwards, he didn't seek me out for congratulations or critique. He nodded across the room, the smallest communion, and returned to clusters of black suits and muted ties. The compliments came to him. The whispers came to me. A junior associate I barely knew told me it was the best speech the firm had given in years, and then lowered her voice to ask if it was true he had asked for my help personally. I said nothing and refilled my coffee. At the end of the day, when the corridor lights thinned to an evening hush, he appeared in my doorway again, and this time he said thank you. His thanks was not decoration. It weighed what it should. The project that followed took the casual privacy of our work and hardened it into a habit. We had been shortlisted for a civic redevelopment proposal, a riverfront site that belonged to everyone and no one. We needed public meetings, diagrams that made sense to people who did not care about load-bearing walls, and the translation of vision into civic patience. He asked me to be his point person for external messaging. I accepted because it was my job, and also because I had already begun to crave the friction of his presence. He didn't flirt. He didn't linger. He asked questions like a man solving a geometry problem no one else had noticed. He demanded clarity and then let silence do the rest. In conference rooms that smelled like carpet cleaner and ambition, he studied me the way he studied spreadsheets, reading not just numbers but the space between them. In the evenings, when most of the office had fled to families and gyms and dates, we worked quietly, the hush between us occupied by the beat of the city, the occasional hum of an elevator that never stopped on our floor, and the unadmitted heat of proximity. Once, reaching at the same time for a draft across the table, my fingertips grazed the back of his hand. It felt like touching a live wire on a cold day, a brightness that shocked without burning. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. Nothing more happened. Something did. His assistant, a woman named Margot, who had been with him at 2 previous companies, watched me with a speculative kindness. She asked once if I took cream or sugar in the late afternoon, and when I said black, she said that made sense and left it at that. The gossip sharpened. A senior partner who had always treated me like an obliging niece began to pause mid-sentence when I entered a room. A designer with a tendency to speak as though arranging flowers asked who was really in charge of the narrative these days, and smiled like it was a joke. I developed strategies, arriving at meetings precisely on time, leaving a beat after he did, keeping doors open and blinds unclosed, allowing professionalism to be a visible garment. It did not change the rumor mill's appetite. Rumors prefer their own seasoning. We traveled once to a conference in Chicago where he was on a panel about ethical redevelopment. The flight was crowded, the kind that made even tall men appear folded. We sat in separate rows, as if to prove a point neither of us had made. I saw the top of his head from my aisle seat, the way he held a pen as if it had more uses than writing. At the hotel, he checked in while I pretended my phone contained a crisis. We met in the lobby an hour later with the neutral relief of colleagues in a city that smelled faintly of rain and taxi exhaust. In the conference hall, he spoke with an intent that was almost intimate. Not because of what he said, which was precise and careful, but because of how he allowed himself to be seen considering. It is a seductive thing, a mind at work. After we stood near the tall windows while a light drizzle ticked against the glass. He noted that our proposal back home would live or die by the way we handled fear, not facts. He said he trusted me to find the words for that. He said my name then, just my name, and it sounded like a promise he hadn't meant to make. That night, after the obligatory receptions and polished laughter, the elevator faltered between floors. The lights fluttered and steadied. We felt the mechanical shrug under our feet. The car stopped. We were suspended in a humming box, the kind of pause that makes you count your breaths. I pressed the call button and spoke to a calm voice that promised minutes, perhaps a dozen. We stood side by side, closer than a conversation required. The primary scent was metal and carpet glue, but under it was him. Linen and something citrus, the warmth that can't be bottled. He said softly that he had sworn, after his wife died, to keep his life in neat compartments. Work here, grief there, a tidy drawer for everything. He said he had done well. He said it without pride. He said the only real lie he told himself was that compartments are doors and can be closed forever. He didn't look at me. Neither of us moved. The elevator hummed like a distant, patient engine. I felt my own throat tighten, a recognition rather than sympathy. I told him I had once labeled boxes in a storage unit with a similar hunger for control. I told him that after my divorce I had labeled one box kitchen sundries, when it actually contained the wedding album. He laughed once, quietly. It felt like hearing a cello. The elevator lurched and resumed. The doors opened to an empty hall, the carpet patterned in geometric confusion. We stepped out as if we had not been changed by stopping. We were changed anyway. Back at the office, the riverfront project accelerated. The city council had a deadline that was not ours but became ours by proximity. We drafted press statements for community meetings that grew tense and hopeful in equal measure. We were careful around each other in ways we had not been before, not with avoidance but with an awareness that attention itself had grown heavier. When he handed me a page, I felt the ghost of his fingertips after the paper was gone. When I gave feedback, he received it not as correction, but as a shared vow. The gossip grew ecstatic. The COO, a lean man with perfect cuffs, warned me in a tone like ice that HR would be setting stricter rules about leadership visibility. He smiled as if he felt sorry for me. I met his gaze and said I did not arrive at this job by accident. The crisis did not present itself with a siren. It arrived as a sudden silence. A confidential part of our proposal leaked to a rival firm that announced it as an innovative approach. They were not innovative. They were greedy. The leak contained phrases I had written and a graphic that only 2 departments had access to. Legal scrambled. The board demanded answers. The head of HR, a woman with a velvet voice that never warmed, invited me into a room with frosted glass and too much peppermint tea. She asked me to walk her through my file-sharing habits, my communications with press, my indirect coworkers. The questions were precise and pale. They made me feel both exposed and boring. Someone had slipped a rumor into the rumor mill that I had been sharing more than just words with the CEO, and that my access had become a risk. It slid easily into belief because it fit the hunger of the office, because people prefer stories that punish their betters, because jealousy is a currency you don't need to declare. I felt the flush rise under my skin, the way shame does when you are accused of something you didn't do but might have wished for. I told HR the truth. I told them precisely where each draft had lived and who had breathing room near it. The room felt like an aquarium, the air thin. He found me after and asked, in a voice that hid too much, what they had asked and what I had answered. I told him. He nodded once. He said the board wanted a name, and by name he meant a sacrifice. He said he wouldn't allow it to be me. He said it as if he had already counted the cost. For the first time since he arrived, I raised my voice to him, not loud but edged. I told him I didn't need a knight, I needed a strategy. I told him the only way to avoid being devoured by the whisper machine was to feed it something more interesting. He looked at me the way you look at a skyline you thought you understood and realize you never did. He asked what I proposed. I told him. We called a town hall. We kept the blinds open. We made our case not about the leak, but about the riverfront, about the maps and the missing sidewalks, and the lives under the bridges that the city pretended not to see. I wrote his remarks with a fierceness I did not try to hide. He read them with the restraint that turned fierceness into form. He said the leak would be investigated by an independent firm and that any conflict of interest allegations, including those involving his own office, would be included. He used the word including as if it meant especially. The room listened. The whisper machine paused, disappointed by the lack of blood. It would resume later. It always does. But we had changed the frequency. Late that night, the office half dark, I sat at my desk and watched rain chase itself down the glass in tracks that looked like handwriting. He stood in the doorway and, without stepping in, said he wanted to show me something. We took the elevator down past the lobby into the garage. He walked to the far wall where the windows looked out on the river, low and silt-heavy beneath the city lights. He said he came down here when he needed to think without being seen thinking. He said he wanted to ask me a question without making it part of my job. I told him to ask. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He asked me what I wanted, not from the project, not from the job, but from the life I had disciplined into schedules and reliable coffee. I told him I wanted not to be the person who always arrived a beat after everyone else went home. I told him I wanted the kind of quiet that had a pulse. I told him I wanted to believe in second chances without sounding like a workshop cliché. I told him I wanted to not be afraid of being watched, even when I was with someone who mattered. The garage hummed with the distant electricity of a sleepless building. He stepped closer. Not enough to be scandalous, enough to be honest. He said he had told himself that loving again would make him faithless to the memory he was trying to keep pure. He said he had discovered that memory did not require abstinence, only respect. He said he could not promise no storms, only a dry jacket held at the right moment. He touched my sleeve with 2 fingers, light as if asking permission to turn a page. His touch moved from the cuff to the back of my hand as if it had always been meant to find that path. He did not bend closer. He didn't need to. The night thinned around us, leaving breath and promise and the sound of water under concrete. I moved first, not out of impatience but because choice is better than chance, and because after years of being looked at without being seen, I wanted to be seen with intention. We found each other in that disciplined, elegant way 2 people do when they have learned restraint not from manners, but from pain. We let the air carry the weight we would not put on words, not yet. When he finally rested his forehead against mine, the world receded to the warmth at the bridge of my nose and the steady press of his breath. The office above us kept its secrets. The river kept its. We let the moment have its own quiet language, not more than a touch, not less than a vow. And when we finally parted, his gaze asked a question I knew how to answer without speaking. The investigation delivered its conclusions with bureaucratic dignity. The leak had come from a designer with gambling debt. He had accessed a shared folder unlocked by customary complacency and a password pattern half the company could have guessed. HR messaged a new policy. The board returned to the comfort of numbers. The rumor mill spun in search of a new bead to thread. The COO offered me a precise apology for the stress this had caused and congratulated me on my composure in a tone that was almost human. I wrote a statement for the press that did not dance but did not slouch. Our proposal was accepted by the city, with notes that tightened our budgets and loosened our hearts. The riverfront would be refitted with a park that made room for memory rather than erasing it. In the weeks that followed, we practiced discretion as if it were a new language we had actually always spoken. We did not invent alibis. We did not lie to people who were not asking. We let our attention, when it was about work, be visible. When it was not about work, we let it be ours. There were small contraband moments. The warmth of his hand at my back when we passed through a crowded corridor. The way he said my name after a meeting while still looking at a chart. The way I left a note on his desk, 3 words and a line from the jazz song that seemed to follow us down the hallways. I learned the weight of his silences and the meaning of his pauses. He learned my habit of staring out at the rain to think, and my inability to drink tea without burning my tongue. It wasn't perfect. Perfect is a word I have cut from so many drafts it no longer has meaning. There were days we misread each other's distance and hours we practiced a professional indifference so scrupulously that it felt like a punishment. There were evenings I went home alone and stood in my kitchen, listening to an old record while the kettle boiled, and felt that particular ache that arrives when you know someone could be there and isn't. There were mornings he came into my office with a face I didn't recognize, tight with board calls or the old clean grief that visits without knocking. I learned not to fix what I could not fix. He learned not to command what did not answer to command. On the day the city announced the riverfront plans publicly, he asked me to accompany him to a community meeting in a school gymnasium that smelled like floor polish and optimism. We sat on metal chairs, while a man with a voice like sand told a story about his father teaching him to fish near the old pilings. A girl asked if there would be a place for her grandmother to sit that wasn't a bench. I made notes. He listened with the posture of someone offering a seat. After, as we walked through the school hallway with its rows of children's paintings, he said he had rewritten something. He handed me a card from his pocket. It was the penultimate paragraph of the speech I had written for his first investor day, the one where he had promised not to pretend neighborhoods were numbers. He had changed one sentence. He had added, "What we build together will have windows. We will see each other through them." I kept the card in my desk, under the blotter where I kept a photograph of my younger self. Not because I was sentimental, but because I had finally learned the kind of keeping that is not hoarding but honoring. The office gossip softened with the seasons, as gossip does when it is denied the satisfaction of drama. We continued to work the project, and the project worked us, sanding our habits into smoother, kinder shapes. We learned to make room for each other's ghosts without turning the office into a mausoleum. Once, in a late-night meeting when the lights overhead hummed in that tired way, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment longer than professionalism recommends. When I opened them, he was watching me in a way that didn't demand, only safeguarded. It felt like bliss disguised as a managerial habit. There were conversations, eventually with real words. He told me about the hospital corridor, where he had memorized the pattern of ceiling tiles. How afterwards he had measured his days in tasks because tasks didn't die. I told him about the first apartment I rented after my ex-husband left. How every surface felt like a borrowed room, and how I had arranged the forks with a reverence that would have been comical to anyone else. We held the hard truths gently, and where they cut we pressed them into something that resembled wisdom. We were careful with our private life because carefulness is another word for tenderness when you are over 45. There were dinners made at short notice, plates washed in companionable silence, brief kisses at doorways that felt like punctuation rather than exclamation. There were longer nights, too, when the world outside thinned to a murmur, and the skin between us warmed into that simple, deep relief of being known without performance. If there were moments of intimacy, They were ours to keep in the room where we left the lights low and the curtains partway open to the city, so the late-night skyline wrote its faint calligraphy across the wall like a blessing. The night faded around us, leaving only breath and promise. The next day we went to work, our faces composed, our eyes unafraid to meet. We did not announce anything when it would have sounded like a press release. We did not hide, not really. The people who mattered learned to read a different kind of footnote in the way he moved to stand near me before a tense meeting, in the way I scanned the room for him a beat longer than required. Margot, practical as a metronome, began scheduling his late meetings at times that matched the rhythm of my work. She never said a word. The COO adjusted his tone with me incrementally, as ambitious men do when they sense they have misread the plot. HR updated policies, as HR does. The board, having gotten what it wanted from the riverfront deal, allowed its attention to drift. We were left with the substance of our days. Work that mattered, and a private grace that grew more solid each time it was not exposed. When the first segment of the river park opened, I walked there alone at dusk before the ribbon cutting. The path curved near the water and then rose gently, a gesture of invitation rather than command. The benches weren't benches at all but long shared slabs that allowed strangers to decide where to begin and end. There were small brass plates along the railing with quotations from people who had lived along the river for decades, bakers and bus drivers, and a woman who ran a bookshop out of her garage. I stood reading their words and heard footsteps behind me. He appeared at my shoulder as if he had always belonged to this view. We did not touch. We stood side by side and watched the water carry the city's light in pieces. He said the project had taught him something he wished he had known when he was younger. That leadership wasn't the trick of being right, but the discipline of making room for more than one truth at a time. I told him that love wasn't a reward for resilience, but sometimes it arrived when resilience had made a house and left one lamp burning. We said these things the way older people say such things, simply without the fever of a manifesto, knowing we were not the first to discover them. Months slipped by with the satisfying thrum of a good machine. There were new projects and new fires to put out, new mornings where rain turned the city into a watercolor and elevators hummed like patient teachers. Our partnership became the kind that made meetings easier because it removed a certain friction from the room. He stopped needing his speeches rewritten from the bone. He began writing sentences that sounded like him and like the better version of him too. Sometimes I changed nothing at all. Sometimes I took out a comma and felt as if I had shifted a tide. People sometimes ask how you know you have chosen correctly. The truth is, you don't, not the way you know the answer to a math problem. You know later in the accumulation of small, clean joys that don't require explanation. You know when you look up from your desk and see the man who changed your definitions standing in the doorway with a file and the calm that has become its own language. You know when your hand finds his in a crowded lobby for a quick second and feels not like theft but like rightness. You know when the office lights dim one by one and his shadow always lingers near yours, not to consume it, not to outpace it, but to stand alongside as two separate forms making a larger shape. On a winter evening a year after he first stood in my doorway with a draft and an unspent look, we sat in the empty conference room where the city lights poured in like a bright tide. The building creaked in the cold the way old structures do, honest about their age. He spread the maps of a new project, a library this time, a place for the city to keep its stories, and asked me what it should say. I told him it should say that the town had learned to hear itself. He set his hand on the table, palm down, a map of veins and years, and I placed my hand beside it. Not over, beside. After a while, he slid his fingers to mine. The glass reflected us, two silhouettes with heads inclined, as if listening to the same music. Somewhere far down the corridor, someone laughed quietly. The elevators rested. The rain began again, a soft percussion. We sat without rushing, letting the room and its bright rectangular silence become the nearest thing to a vow that an office can hold. If I believed in a moral, I might say that rewriting a speech rewrote the speaker. But the truth was slower and steadier. We rewrote ourselves sentence by sentence, day after day, until the story we were living made room for both our losses and our late-come luck. The city carried us, the way cities do when you choose them and they choose you back. And when strangers walked the river path we had fought to shape and paused at the railing where the water took the light downstream, I imagined they felt what we had learned to feel every day. That love, like architecture, is just the most honest kind of conversation a life can have with itself. And that the best of it is built not with trumpets, but with a hand on the small of your back at the right moment, a whisper of breath near your temple, and the steady knowledge that even when the lights dim and doors close, someone waits in the hallway, unhurried by the hour, ready to walk out into the rain with you.